Picture this. It's the 1920s. The world's still feeling the aftermath of the Great War, and while other parts of Europe are beginning to find their footing, Albania is struggling to keep its head above water. Now, most people don't know much about Albania in the 1920s, but trust me, it's a fascinating chapter of history. The country's sitting at a crossroads, fighting through economic hardship, political chaos, and social unrest, all while trying to carve out its identity. So, let's start with the economy. Albania, back then, was what we'd call underdeveloped. Picture a rural agrarian society where the majority of people lived off farming. The key exports were things like tobacco, olive oil, and wool. Nice, but limited in terms of global trade impact. Albania wasn't making big waves economically. Their imports, however, were heavy. Think manufactured goods and machinery, stuff they really needed but couldn't produce themselves. The economy wasn't growing fast enough to keep up, and the aftermath of World War I, plus internal political instability, meant things were rough. You're talking about one of the poorest nations in Europe, with an infrastructure that was practically non-existent outside of a few urban areas. Now, in terms of innovation and technology, don't expect a lot of cutting-edge breakthroughs. Albania was barely crawling out of the war's shadow. Industrialization? That was still a distant dream. Most of the country still relied on traditional farming techniques, and the technology they did have was old and minimal. Electricity and transportation were things you'd only see in the cities. The rural areas where most people lived had very little access to modern technology. It wasn't the kind of place you'd find tech startups or even modern factories. It was the opposite of what was happening in other parts of Europe during this time. On the political front, the 1920s were a mess. Albania had only gained independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1912, so it's still figuring out who it wants to be. The government? Chaotic. There were coups, revolutions, and constant power struggles. A little instability, right? The country went through several different factions trying to take control, and at one point, King Zog I even took power. But before that, there was a brief period of republic governance. Nothing stuck, and the political scene was a mess, with rivalries not just internally, but also with neighboring countries like Italy and Greece, who were eyeing parts of Albanian territory for themselves. By the end of the 1920s, things were starting to settle, but it wasn't exactly a calm ride. In terms of military power, well, Albania's armed forces weren't anything to write home about. The army was small, underfunded, and mainly focused on keeping things under control within its own borders. There were some border skirmishes, particularly with Greece, and the military relied on guerrilla tactics rather than anything sophisticated. They didn't have modern artillery, air forces, or anything you'd expect from a stronger European power. But Albania made do with what they had: small arms, rifles, a couple outdated artillery pieces. It was a tough military, but not a very advanced one. Let's talk about social conditions for a minute. Albania in the 1920s was a place where most people were living in poverty. There was limited access to basic things like healthcare and education. The vast majority of people lived in isolated villages with almost no infrastructure. And with a predominantly rural society, the literacy rate was pretty low, especially in the countryside. If you were a woman in Albania during this time, your rights were severely restricted. Patriarchal values dominated society, and women didn't have much say in how things were run. Religion played a big role too. Most Albanians were Muslim, but there were also significant Christian communities, particularly in the south. But despite this religious diversity, the country was going through a wave of secularization by the late 1920s. When it comes to healthcare and quality of life, it's not much better. Life expectancy was low. Diseases like malaria, tuberculosis, and cholera were common, especially in rural areas. With no proper healthcare system, people often turned to traditional healers or remedies passed down through generations. Sanitation and clean water were not always available, and the whole country was struggling with a lack of basic infrastructure. There were no welfare programs, so people leaned on family and community support when things got tough. The quality of life was poor for most Albanians. But in terms of ethnic makeup, Albania was pretty homogeneous. Albanians made up the majority, but there were minorities, particularly in the southern regions, where you had Greeks, and in the north, where there were small communities of Serbs and Montenegrins. Ethnic tensions were a constant, particularly with Greece and Yugoslavia, which both had their own claims on Albanian territory. You could feel the pressure from outside, and internally, minorities often faced discrimination, making for a tense atmosphere. Now, let's shift to some of the key figures of the time. You've probably heard of Ismail Kamali. He was one of the key players in Albania's independence movement. He had a big role in the early years of Albania as a free country, but by 1931, he'd passed away. Then there's Ahmed Zogu. Zogu is the guy who really came into power toward the end of the 1920s and would later declare himself King Zog I in 1928. This man would go on to leave a huge mark on Albania's history as the first king of the newly formed monarchy. When it comes to the government and political leaders, like I said, things were constantly changing. Albania had a bunch of different republican governments in the early 1920s, but by 1924, Zogu came in and took control, officially shifting things to an authoritarian regime. In 1928, he declared himself king, and this was the start of a new chapter for Albania, one that would see some efforts to modernize, even if they were constantly interrupted by political instability and foreign influences. Zog's reign was definitely a mixed bag. There were efforts to strengthen the government, but the country was still too unstable to thrive fully. Crime during this time was largely about smuggling and organized crime. With a weak central government, crime was everywhere, and some of it even had political motives. Many local factions operated in the shadows, trying to push for a republican government or, in some cases, hoping for the return of the monarchy. And Albania's mountainous terrain made it pretty hard for the government to maintain control over the rural areas, which were often lawless and chaotic. On the cultural side of things, the arts and culture in Albania during the 1920s were heavily influenced by its Ottoman past. You had lots of folk music, traditional dances, and oral storytelling. But there was also a growing interest in modern art, particularly in the cities like Tirana. Writers and intellectuals were starting to push for a new national identity for Albania, and literature began to reflect those nationalist themes. At the same time, traditional instruments like the sifteli were still very much alive in the countryside. Religion, mysticism, and folklore were also really important to Albanian identity. Even though the country was becoming more secular, religion was still a big part of daily life. Most Albanians were Muslim, but there was a significant Orthodox and Catholic Christian population as well. And the folklore? Let's just say Albania's mountains were filled with stories of brave warriors and mythical creatures. Skanderbeg, the national hero who fought the Ottomans back in the 15th century, was a key figure in many of these stories. His legacy as a symbol of resistance was still alive in the 1920s. To wrap it up, Albania in the 1920s was in a tough spot, economically, politically, and socially. But it was also a country fighting to find itself, with people like King Zog I trying to push the country forward into modernity. The people? Proud, fiercely independent, and living in a mix of old traditions and new ideas. It wasn't easy, but it was definitely a time of transformation. Thanks for tuning in to The World as We Know It and joining me in another chapter of world history. As always, there are more detailed notes in the description, and we welcome any requests or recommendations in the comments section. If you found this video helpful, entertaining, or educational, please consider liking this video and subscribing to support our channel. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.